Modern culture often portrays Viking life as rugged, individualistic, and free. Archaeology tells a far more constrained story. Viking society was not built around the autonomy of the individual. It was built around constant human proximity. Privacy was not merely limited, it was structurally absent. The core of Viking domestic life was the longhouse. Excavated examples across Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Iceland show a striking consistency in design. Most longhouses measured between 20 and 30 meters in length, with widths rarely exceeding 6 to 7 meters. Some elite halls reached 50 meters or more, but size did not translate into privacy. Despite their length, these structures were internally open. Archaeological floor plans show a central hearth running along the main axis, with raised platforms or benches lining the walls. These platforms served as sleeping areas, workspaces, and seating. There is no consistent evidence of permanent internal partitions that would have separated individuals or families into private rooms. This layout had direct consequences. Reconstructions based on floor area and artifact distribution suggest that a single longhouse commonly housed 20 to 40 people, sometimes more. These included extended family members, children, elderly relatives, servants, and seasonal laborers. Humans and animals often shared the same building, separated only by low barriers or spatial convention. This arrangement was not a response to poverty or lack of skill. Viking builders demonstrated advanced carpentry and ship construction, roof engineering, and load-bearing joinery. They were capable of subdividing space if privacy had been valued. The absence of private rooms reflects a deliberate social choice, rather than a technical limitation. Written sources align with this interpretation. Norse law codes and saga narratives consistently depict domestic life as publicly observable. Arguments, legal negotiations, punishments, and reconciliations occurred within shared spaces. Even sensitive matters unfolded in the presence of others. There is no clear cultural expectation that individuals should be shielded from observation inside the household. In Viking society, visibility functioned as a mechanism of control. Reputation, honor, and trust depended on being seen. Actions carried social weight precisely because they were witnessed. Privacy, as understood today, would have undermined this system. A person who could withdraw unseen was a person beyond immediate social regulation. Climate intensified these conditions. Paleoclimate data indicates that Viking Age Scandinavia experienced long dark winters with limited daylight and prolonged cold. For much of the year, outdoor activity was restricted. Entire households spent weeks or months largely confined indoors. During these periods, proximity was not intermittent, it was continuous. The longhouse became a space of uninterrupted human presence. There was no escape into solitude. No physical boundary allowed emotional or sensory withdrawal. Sounds, movements, conversations, and bodily rhythms overlapped constantly. Privacy did not merely fail to exist. It had no spatial foundation on which to form. This lack of personal space shaped social expectations from childhood. Children grew up never experiencing isolation. Emotional regulation developed in a context of constant observation. Silence, endurance, and restraint became adaptive traits. Expression was moderated not by personal choice, but by collective presence. Importantly, this system applied across social classes. Even high-status individuals did not retreat into private chambers within the household. Authority figures slept, ate, and lived among others. Power was exercised through presence, rather than distance. Hierarchy was visible, not secluded. The absence of privacy was therefore not an accident of architecture. It was a cornerstone of social organization. Proximity reinforced cooperation, discouraged deviation, and bound individuals tightly to the group. To exist outside this proximity was to exist at the margins of society. The key insight is this. Viking society did not simply lack privacy because it had not yet been invented. Privacy was incompatible with a culture built on collective survival, mutual surveillance, and compressed living. The individual, as a spatially separate unit, did not exist. This matters because it reframes how we understand Viking life. The stressors of that world were not limited to violence or scarcity. They were embedded in daily existence. Constant proximity was not dramatic. It was mundane. And precisely because it was normal, its effects were deep and cumulative. The absence of privacy was therefore not an accident of architecture. It was a cornerstone of social organization. Proximity reinforced cooperation, discouraged deviation, and bound individuals tightly to the group. To exist outside this proximity was to exist at the margins of society. Privacy, as a concept, was incompatible with a culture built on collective survival and constant visibility. The individual was not a spatial unit. It was a social function embedded in the group. What this meant in practice is often overlooked. Living without privacy was not an abstract condition. It shaped how people slept, how they moved, how they rested, and how their senses were constantly engaged by others. When a society removes the possibility of physical separation, personal boundaries do not simply weaken. They dissolve into the shared environment. And that shared environment was not quiet, not empty, and not neutral. It was a long, enclosed space where bodies, voices, smells, heat, animals, and fire overlapped every hour of the day. Once privacy disappeared at the structural level, it did not remain an abstract social condition. It became physical. It acted on the body hour after hour, shaping how people moved, rested, and regulated themselves inside the shared space of the Longhouse. Archaeological reconstructions show that Viking longhouses were long but narrow. With typical interior widths of 6 to 7 meters, space quickly became saturated once hearths, benches, storage areas, and working zones were in use. There were no transitional spaces, no corridors, no buffer zones between bodies. Every movement occurred within reach of someone else. Sleeping intensified this compression. The raised platforms along the walls were collective sleeping areas. They were not divided into personal sections. Several people slept shoulder to shoulder, separated at most by cloaks or thin layers of bedding. At night, the boundary between one body and another was reduced to fabric and habit. This arrangement eliminated physical withdrawal. Even rest occurred under constant sensory exposure. Breathing rhythms overlapped. Movement disturbed others. Sleep was light, fragmented, and responsive to the presence of the group rather than isolated from it. Daily activities offered no relief. The same interior space was used for food preparation, tool-making, textile work, childcare, and conversation. These activities did not occur in sequence. They overlapped continuously. Work and rest were not separated by rooms or schedules. They blended into a single shared rhythm. The sensory environment was dense and persistent. Central hearths burned for long periods, especially in winter. Experimental archaeology has shown that even with roof openings, smoke lingered inside reconstructed longhouses, irritating eyes and lungs. Heat accumulated unevenly. Air circulation was limited. Smell from fuel, cooking, damp clothing, animals, and unwashed bodies mixed into a constant background that never fully cleared. Sound behaved the same way. Voices carried without obstruction. Coughing, movement, tools striking wood or metal, animals shifting in place. There were no surfaces designed to absorb noise. Silence was rare. Even when no one spoke, the presence of others remained audible. These conditions matter because personal boundaries are not defined only by sight. They depend on the ability to control sensory input. Inside the Longhouse, no individual controlled sound, smell, touch, or rhythm. The environment enforced shared sensory exposure at all times. Animals further intensified this exposure. Archaeological evidence indicates that livestock were often kept within the same structure, particularly during winter months. This increased warmth and survival efficiency, but it also introduced additional movement, waste, noise, and odor. Human bodies adapted to the presence of animals not as companions, but as unavoidable elements of the shared space. Over time, the body adjusted. Muscles remained alert. Attention stayed broad. People learned to filter rather than escape. This was not comfort. It was endurance. The nervous system adapted to constant stimulation by lowering expectations of separation. Crucially, this adaptation began early. Children raised in longhouses never experienced solitude. From infancy, their sensory world was crowded. Touch was frequent. Sound was continuous. Observation was constant. Emotional regulation developed under exposure, not withdrawal. Privacy was not something lost later in life. It was something never introduced. Archaeological wear patterns reinforce this picture. Floors show heavy, continuous traffic across the entire interior. There is no evidence of zones reserved for retreat or isolation. Every part of the space was lived in, used, and shared. Rest occurred within the same environment as labor and interaction. The Longhouse functioned as a single organism. Heat, breath, fatigue, and movement circulated through it. Individual schedules collapsed into a collective tempo dictated by daylight, weather, and necessity. When one person stirred, others adjusted. When one worked, the rhythm of the space shifted. This collective tempo reduced the need for verbal coordination. People learned to anticipate each other's movements. But it also removed opportunities for reset. There was no pause from social presence. No moment when the body could disengage from others and recalibrate. Over years, this shaped what it meant to inhabit a body. Identity was reinforced through tolerance, not separation. Boundaries were not asserted. They dissolved into the environment. The self did not end at the skin. It extended into the shared space. The Longhouse did not merely shelter Viking life. It conditioned it through repetition, through compression, through constant exposure. Proximity stopped feeling intrusive, not because it was harmless, but because it was unavoidable. And when an environment trains the body long enough, its pressures no longer register as pressure. They register as normal. When human proximity becomes constant, it does not remain a background condition. Over time, it reshapes behavior itself. In Viking society, the absence of privacy did not produce continuous conflict. It produced something more durable. Adaptation. In an environment where withdrawal was impossible, emotional expression had consequences. Any reaction, no matter how small, occurred in front of others. Anger could not be released unseen. Grief could not unfold privately. Fear had witnesses. This altered how emotion was handled long before anyone reflected on it. The result was not emotional absence, but compression. Feelings were contained, shortened, and regulated to avoid destabilizing the group. Displays that drew prolonged attention carried social cost. Endurance became functional. Silence became efficient. Not as virtues, but as tools for survival within a shared space. Authority operated under the same conditions. Leaders did not govern from behind walls. They lived among those they commanded. Their actions, habits, and failures were visible. Power relied less on distance and more on reputation reinforced through constant observation. Authority was sustained by presence, not separation. This visibility created a dense web of social memory. Everyone knew who had acted, who had failed, who had endured. There was no erasure through privacy. Social identity accumulated through shared recollection rather than personal reinvention. To be known was unavoidable. To escape judgment was rare. Conflict unfolded publicly. Arguments did not retreat into private rooms. They resolved quickly or became permanently embedded in collective awareness. This discouraged prolonged hostility, but increased social pressure. Tension had nowhere to hide. It either dissipated or hardened. Children absorbed these dynamics without instruction. Raised in constant proximity, they learned social regulation through exposure. Boundaries were not explained. They were experienced. Acceptable behavior was visible. Unacceptable behavior produced immediate feedback. Emotional self-control was shaped by observation rather than reflection. This produced individuals highly attuned to social cues. In crowded environments, anticipation matters more than reaction. Subtle shifts in tone, posture, and mood carried meaning. People became skilled readers of collective atmosphere. This sensitivity was adaptive, but it came at a cost. Individuality had limited space to unfold. Personal rhythms, habits, and emotional needs were continually adjusted to match the group. Identity formed relationally. Who you were depended on how you functioned within shared space. There was little opportunity to retreat, reassess, or redefine oneself in isolation. From a biological perspective, the absence of solitude altered stress regulation. Modern research shows that periods of withdrawal help reset emotional and physiological systems. In Viking society, such periods were rare. Stress was not episodic. It was ambient. The body adapted not by eliminating stress, but by dulling response. This dampening increased tolerance. It allowed people to function under conditions that would overwhelm modern individuals. But tolerance is not neutrality. It narrows emotional range. It shifts baselines. Discomfort does not disappear. It becomes normalized. Over generations, this normalization stabilized. Viking society did not perceive itself as crowded. It lacked a contrasting model. Proximity was not experienced as intrusion, because it was never optional. What modern observers interpret as psychological pressure was simply the texture of daily life. This is the unsettling insight. Human beings adapt not only to environments, but to the costs those environments impose. When a condition is constant, it ceases to feel abnormal, even when it reshapes behavior profoundly. Viking resilience was not the product of exceptional toughness. It was the outcome of continuous conditioning. Bodies, emotions, and social structures were shaped together by climate, architecture, and necessity. Endurance emerged not from choice, but from lack of alternative. The erasure of privacy was not cruelty. It was strategy. Survival required cohesion. Cohesion required proximity. and proximity quietly rewrote what it meant to be a person within that world. The cost of that rewriting is difficult to measure. It left few physical traces, but it shaped how people related, endured, and understood themselves. And when a society adapts deeply enough, its constraints stop feeling like constraints. They simply become life,